Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and Bill Barlee is our storyteller and ace verifier of facts. And not to my knowledge, prevaricator in any way.
No, we're pretty careful, Mike.
Yeah, this is one of those shows when you have to, as the historian, tread very lightly, because there's all sorts of stories of lost mines and lost treasures, but most of them are just that, stories.
Yeah, most of them are barroom tales made up in somebody's idle time, and that's the way the story comes out. There are no dates, there are no names, there are no specific areas. But this is an interesting story, Mike. I think you'll find it quite fascinating. Something I alluded to years ago on the program, and decided to go back to it because of the location of the area, and I call it the puzzle of Deadmans Hill, the spider's web.
Okay, what part of British Columbia, I presume, are we heading to?
Yeah, well, we're heading back into that boundless boundary country, which is a very historic region of British Columbia, especially in mining history, Mike. Yeah. And to give you to set the table on this, I think we should look at the boundary country as a whole, and because it produced copper and gold and silver, and in prodigious quantities in certain of the camps.
Guess what? The boundary country starts, I guess, primarily when you get over to Christina Lake and you start heading up the hill to Blueberry-Paulson. That's the eastern edge of boundary.
And that's the first place we'd look at. We'd look at some of those small mines in that burnt basin country, which is right near the old town, or the old, really not semi-town of Paulson, which didn't survive very long. And they had gold and they had copper and they had some silver in there. And as you move westward along the boundary country, you get into Franklin Camp, and of course Franklin Camp was notable for one spectacular mine, and this was the famous Union, and literally millions and millions of dollars came out of the Union in gold. It was a high-grade gold camp up the North Fork or the Granby River, and lasted. And they actually made that discovery in the 20s. Didn't do much in the 90s.
Really late. We always think of the gold rushes as happening in '58 or something. This was a 1920s event.
That's right, and it was one of those camps that produced gold, not out of a quartz found ore, but out of a more common ore. And then as we move west again, you get into that Eholt country, and Eholt's long vanished, of course, but we had the BC mine and a number of other copper mines in there, basically a copper camp. And then as you move along towards Old Greenwood, you would go into the Jewel Lake country, and you had some great mines up there, mostly gold, Dentonia and some of the others. And Jewel Lake, there's still some activity in that area. Then you get into Greenwood, and you look north of Greenwood, and you came into the famous Deadwood camp. And Deadwood was a prodigious camp, produced millions of dollars worth of copper ore, and they had a smelter right in Greenwood to handle the Deadwood ores, and this is the Dominion Copper Company smelter right in Greenwood.
So Greenwood didn't just operate, because we haven't mentioned Phoenix yet, but
no, we haven't.
They were built for two reasons.
Yeah, we will come back to Phoenix, because the Phoenix ores went down by rail into the Granby smelter, which was in Grand Forks. So it went down about 20-odd miles, running about 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and almost 20 years in a row.
We'll get back to that in a second.
Okay.
Deadwood is another place.
So Deadwood's interesting. Then we go down Boundary Creek, which was a famous gold creek, Placer Gold Creek, and you get up into that area around McCarran Creek, and you had the number 7 mine and the Texas mine, and they sent their ore, mostly gold, down into the Sunset smelter. And you can still see remains of the old Sunset smelter today. So that was only about 4 miles away from the Dominion Copper Company smelter. So you have 3 smelters in that area, which is really quite fascinating.
That's, even till this day, you don't see a lot of vegetation growing on the hillsides. Do you think the smelters have had that longest-term effect?
Yeah, perhaps, but remember that this is kind of barren country. It tends to be rocky country because it's mining country, and it's been burned over as well, Mike. Okay. But then as you move farther west up the Kettle, you get into that Camp McKinney country. And that Camp McKinney country was one of the earliest, in fact, one of the earliest gold mines in British Columbia, 1880s. And the Caribou Amelia was the big mine there. And a town grew up around it, and it was rather fascinating. Then you go north of that, and you get into Carmi. And Carmi had the Butcher Boy and the famous Carmi mine. Those were both gold properties. But just a handful of miles away, 5 or 6 miles away, was the famous Beaverdale country.
Silver.
40 million ounces of silver came out of the Beaverdale country.
Rock Creek had a gold rush of its own.
Well,
didn't
sure it did. Rock Creek was famous in the about 1858, 1859, produced millions of ounces of placer gold. So here you have the boundless boundary with a mining history that is seldom equaled anywhere in the Northwest, and this is the basis of our story. But, you know, with all these countries, Mike, and all the stories we have to tell, you find that, as we alluded to before, most of them are false. Okay. But there are about 6 stories out of this country. Certainly one lost treasure, and we touched on that about 7 years ago.
That's the gold bars at McKinney?
That's the gold bars.
Oh, my memory is clear for gold bars.
Matt Roderick, who was shot eventually, and the gold bars disappeared. I don't think they were ever recovered. They're in 1,000 acres.
Needle in a haystack.
Probably
still
worth
over
$250,000 at least, and trying to find it would be almost impossible. Okay. So that's one. That's the lost treasure. Now we get to the lost mines. You get down into Rock Creek proper, and we talked about Rock Creek several years ago and the lost run off Denver Bar. Now, Denver Bar produced at least 5,000 ounces of placer gold, I think more, because they didn't have good records in those days. My research indicates they produced probably 9,000 or 10,000 ounces, and that disappears off towards the north, an old run just off Denver Bar, off Rock Creek. And then you get down into the Greenwood area, and you get an interesting old mine called the Captain Gordon Mine, or the Lost Gordon Mine, and that was up in the upper reaches of Boundary Creek. That was a silver proposition, and good evidence of that. You have another lost mine in that Burnt Basin area, which is a high-grade gold property.
Okay, so the concept, now lost mines occur because the guy who found them dies or loses his way or, you know, something goes on. This is another, you figure, not just a possible, but a probable lost mine.
I'll tell you why. The evidence is becoming, at least to my mind, almost overwhelming. And it's one that has never been looked for because it isn't well known. There's never been a story written on it, Mike. This is the first. We alluded to it briefly, 30-second clip on it years and years ago. Yeah. And it kind of piqued my memory because I knew the individual, and the guy's name was Sam Bambini.
And you call it the Spider's Web or the
Spider's Web or the Puzzle of Deadmans Hill.
Okay, we're going to find out about Sam Bambini and the Spider's Web, the Puzzle of Deadman's Hill, right after this break. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We're on the search of the Puzzle of Deadman's Hill or the Spider's Web, but the name is Sam Bambini. Where do you know him from?
Well, Sam Bambini is was an old resident of Greenwood. He died a few years ago. I knew him well. I knew his son well, Sonny Bambini. He's now passed on. His daughter still lives in Greenwood, and he lived in a place called Anaconda, which was an old rival town of Greenwood, just out of Greenwood, just to the west.
That sounds like an old mining name. Anaconda follows silver mines and other mines.
Copper mine, actually. Mines? The Anaconda copper mine in Montana, near Butte, Montana. So I interviewed him about 20 years ago, Mike. And I said to old Sam, I said, Sam, do you remember anything, does anything stick in your memory that you can recall that was really quite fascinating in this area? He said, well, a lot of things, he said, but something keeps on coming back, keeps on recurring. And he said about late 1940s. Now, I think it was 48 or 1949. And Sam, now first of all, Sam was not a prospector. He wasn't really interested. He was a hunter, and he wasn't a miner at all. So he'd never done any mining. He hadn't prospected. Mm-hmm. And so the story he relayed to me was fairly logical. He said he drove up to Phoenix. He's deer hunting, and Phoenix is up above the 4,000-foot level. So that's the right, and it's deer country up in there. Those rolling hills and draws and creeks and so on. And he went just beyond Phoenix.
So
just east of Phoenix. And it was my fault because I didn't ask him whether he went just south of Phoenix towards the American border, or he went just north towards Deadmans Hill. But he was in that country beyond Phoenix, and he hunted all day, unsuccessfully as it happened. And he went back by a slightly different route. And as he walked back in this different route, and he was not in any big rush. Sam wasn't that type of man. He was kind of easygoing, and he came across a little pit. And you're careful of the pits in that country, because sometimes there's a shaft that goes straight down for 30 or 40 feet. maybe a blind shaft or something you can't see. So you're fairly cautious. He looked down in the pit and it was all overgrown and it was...
I mean, people have been mining here
Yeah,
for 40 years,
yeah.
digging these pits looking for evidence, and
Sure.
so they're everywhere.
in that area, almost 60 years. So we looked down in the pit, and there was some colored rock down there, some oxidized rock. Looks like some quartz. So he thought, oh, well, yeah. He reached down and picked up a piece of quartz and put it in his pack and walked home and promptly forgot about it. And then a week or so later, he decided to put it out on the shelf, and he did that. And about a year and a half or 2 years later, a friend came along, looked at it and said, gosh, that looks pretty interesting to me, Sam, he says. And this guy was fairly well versed in geology. Now, I don't know what it was, one of the Forshaws or somebody in Greenwood, and they looked at that and they said, that's rotten quartz. And it was a rotten quartz, and rotten quartz quite often carries gold. And it does in that country, in that specific area. So we looked at it, and he put it under a glass, and he saw the visible gold in the quartz. He says, Sam, he said, that's marvelous ore. Well, Sam became a little more interested in his chance find of 2 years ago. So Sam looks at it and says, well, I says, I think I can find that. You know, this is the same old story. You think you can go back, but your memory usually or often plays you false. So Sam and his son, Sonny, decided to go back into that area, and they retraced their steps. And they did it a number of times. And they found a number of pits up there, because, Mike, that country is studded with pits. There are holes and tunnels and shafts and pits all over the place, because people are looking for gold or looking for silver or looking for copper. And the problem is, he never found it. 2 years too late. He probably could have gone back a week later and found it, but he couldn't find it 2 years later or 2.5 years later, and he looked intermittently over the years. Yeah. And I thought, okay, at the time I thought, well, yeah, I believe Sam, because Sam was very, very truthful. I know that what he told me was correct, but does it make a lot of geological sense? Well, since I related this on the program about 5 or 6 years ago, I decided to take a look at it. Yeah. And it does make a lot of sense.
Now, we've got one of those wonderful artifacts, an old map that was drawn up about 1897 or so, 98, something like that. And it just shows, and we're going to take a look at it and maybe do some mind reading of Sam Bambini and find out where this pit might be right after this break. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barley. We're talking about a lost mine, a spider's web, puzzle of Deadmans Hill, all of those things. And in order to help us understand a little better, I have here really just a wonderful artifact. It is a map, but it is in such sad shape, I can't open it up from here. But where is Columbia? I've never heard of Columbia.
Well, Columbia, Mike, was going to be a rival of Grand Forks. It was going to eclipse Grand Forks. And so they built just on the western part of Grand Forks, and they had grandiose plans, the MacArthur family and so on, and a guy called Ross, and they started building hotels and so on, but nobody came.
So they figured we'd better get this publicized. The map is created, the town site is created, and what we've done is we've opened this at another occasion and now created a kind of a Xerox copy, but this will do very well.
Yeah.
Where we're looking here is, well, locate me for me on a couple of locations. Where's Greenwood? Where's Phoenix?
Okay.
Where are we talking here?
Here's Grand Forks, which is indicated by Columbia right down there.
Yeah.
Okay? And then you go all the way around, up over the old CPR line, which is here, Mike, past Ehold. That's the next major town that BC mine and other mines, copper mines in there. Then you go down to Greenwood, and old Sam lived in Anaconda. Then you go on to Midway and up to Rock Creek and so on.
Off that way, okay.
Okay?
So Greenwood is where Sam Bambini lives, or near Anaconda.
Actually, he lives in Anaconda, right.
He goes hunting this day in the fall somewhere east of Phoenix. Now, why is this called Greenwood Camp here?
Phoenix was first called Greenwood Camp because they never thought a city would get off the ground, Mike. It was too high. It was in the snow belt. It was above 4,000 feet, much to Greenwood's absolute astonishment. And Greenwood was a bona fide city by about 1898. and it got off the ground in Greenwood, and so Phoenix came into being. Then it was no longer called Greenwood Camp. That was called Phoenix Camp.
Okay. Now, when we talk about Phoenix, there are a couple of very important claims to consider. Nob
Sure.
Hill is
Yep.
one of them.
Yeah,
and
sure.
what's the other one? Old
Nob Hill
Ironside.
and the Old Ironsides. That's
And
right.
those are right there, and we can
Yeah.
see them on this old map.
That's right, we can. And the city was founded right close to them. You can see it right next. The city's right under the shadow of Ironsides and Nob Hill. And the interesting, they were copper properties, but they also produced a lot of gold in this camp, primarily known as a copper camp. You know, gonna rival Butte, never made the grade, but produced more copper and gold than all the mines in the Yukon at the same time. Now, that's something that escaped most people's notice. And the interesting thing is, Mike, their byproduct in copper in this camp was about up to 50,000 ounces a year of gold.
That's a nice little added incentive, having that gold lying around there.
Sure, and when you look at it, Mike, they mined that camp for 20 years, then they came back and mined it in the 50s again for another 15 or 20 years. And I think the total production of gold, and we're talking about gold here, is around or just over 500,000 ounces, over 500,000 ounces of gold.
So there was gold in them thar hills,
Yeah.
which helps again to make our story have veracity.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that gold came from one specific area there. It came from a little area just in Greenwood Camp. If you look down on this map, Mike, you'll see the snowshoe.
Oh, these
you'll see the
see
gold
right here.
Yeah, you'll see the gold drop. You see the
Yellow
yellow
jacket.
jacket. You'll see the rawhide. All of these were high-grade gold properties, and the interesting thing, it was out of quartz, and that's interesting as well. And they were very, very high grade. So that's part of the puzzle. So we know he was near that. And essentially, he was also down in this area here. So I think he hunted from here, Mike, right down here, right down to maybe just beyond May Creek. Now, the other
So
interesting...
there's several creeks. I just want to help locate
Sure.
them. There's that West Fork
Yeah.
of 4th of July Creek, and that's the one
Right.
with the snowdrop and the yellow jacket.
Yeah.
Then the next one south is Taylor Creek.
They call it Taylor Creek. It's now called Scaff Creek. It was
and
called
you can
China
see-
Creek at
And
one
you can
time.
see it's all surrounded
And
by claims there.
The interesting thing about that creek, I was on that creek, had a claim on that creek. We got nuggets up to half an ounce, and nuggets, coarse gold, came out up to an ounce. And the other interesting thing on this map, and this is 97 or 98 map, almost 100 years ago, there's no activity on May Creek.
Not even a claim there.
And May Creek produced some significant gold. Old Bob Campbell mined it. Other miners did very, very well in May Creek. Nuggets up to an ounce again.
Now, let's go back again, because here we have old Sam Bambino.
That's right.
Is hunting somewhere east of Phoenix.
Yep.
Somewhere on that east side of
Yep.
Phoenix, and he found a pit that has got free gold in rotten quartz.
That's right.
And now, if it ever had become a mine, in 1948, there was no more active mining going on there. So, I mean, this is obviously a pit that had been forgotten, that had a good showing in it.
I think it was found by a novice, a guy who was digging, didn't recognize rotten quartz, didn't test it, didn't look at it closely under a glass. But this is why this is called the spider's web. When you look at it, this area here is centered by very, very high-grade gold properties,
Yep.
a very, very good creek, that's
Taylor,
Scaff Creek or
Scaff
Taylor Creek. Also May Creek. On the other side is Boundary Creek, which produced thousands of ounces as well.
Okay. So somewhere in here, this pit shows a very good potential for a gold mine.
There are old cabins up in here scattered all through this country. Unfortunately, not many of them survived, but there are old cabins up at the headwaters. And I think it's a band, Mike, 5 miles by 2 miles, 10 square miles in here where Sam was hunting. And he said it was beyond Phoenix, had to be in this country. He wouldn't have gone across the other side of July Creek.
Well, why don't you just head back up there? I mean, it can't take you much more than a couple of summers to crisscross an area. What's to stop you? What's the obstacle?
Well, 10 square miles is about 64,000 acres. That's the first thing that stops me, Mike. No, not quite. 6,400 acres.
Yeah.
My mathematics was incorrect. And 6,400 acres. If you've ever tried a close analysis, Mike, of 10 acres, you're going to be a long time looking over 10 acres if you're going to prospect it well. And also remember, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of old pits in that area. And I don't know exactly where he was, but if I were 20 years younger and I had some spare time on my hands, I would start at Deadmans Hill, and I would work south towards the American border, crisscrossing that area backwards and forwards to look to exactly where old Sam stumbled across a shallow pit with rotten quartz in it, a stringer of rotten quartz, picks it up, takes it back to Anaconda and discovers that he should have had what we call, you know, the lost mine of Sam Bambini. Some people call it that. I prefer to call it the spider's web.
Okay, now if we know anything about hunting, for example, will be an advantage, because when you go out hunting in the fall, the deer seem to all frequent the higher ridges. So would this be up on a ridge, or would it be down in a valley bottom?
He was coming back. He was heading back through Old Phoenix. And Old Phoenix in the 1940s, the late 1940s, was still standing. Here are a couple of shots of what Sam would have seen as he walked through the old town. These were taken in the 30s and 40s. So it shows some of the buildings still standing, and there were two individuals there, a guy called Forpar Serskew and an old guy called William Banbury, and they hung on hoping it would come back. Eventually it did. Yeah. But it's a fascinating story. I think it's highly probable that there is some gold in there. I think it's closer to May Creek, maybe between May Creek and Skeff Creek, which they call Taylor Creek in this map, rather than that old, heavily prospected area around the snowshoe.
That's been done, eh?
Yep.
Okay, so we look further south. Maybe we don't have to go all the way up to Deadmans Hill. We can start further south around Skeff Creek, Taylor Creek, and work south from there.
Yeah, I still wouldn't skip that Deadmans Hill
You and me,
area.
if we had some time and we were 20 years younger.
Yeah.
Good stuff. All right. Something else is pretty neat about this story, because as you prepare for these shows, you he goes through his archives and his artifacts and stuff, and it's always good to bring a newspaper along, and this is The Ledge. The Ledge is a great old mining camp newspaper. Now, on the back of The Ledge, there's amazingly enough, there's an election going on.
I opened it up this morning, Mike, and I looked at the picture of this man, whom I knew very well, and that's E.C. Henniger.
There he is.
An old E.C. Henniger owned a store in Grand Forks, building supplies and supplies of all types. He was a very fine man.
And he could afford a lot of money. Look at the size of that ad for his election. Vote, it says there, vote Liberal in this case.
Sure.
But down in the bottom corner here, there is a guy by the name of C.A.S. Atwood, who says, Bowser can't win and Oliver's a dead one. Vote the provincial party candidate, C.A.S. Atwood. We've turned the grindstone long enough. It's time to swing our axes June 20th. What's so special about C.A.S. Atwood?
The interesting thing, I knew both of the characters. C.A.S. Atwood was my great uncle. You know, his wife was a sister to my grandmother, and of course I knew the Henniger, and the Henniger family is still in Grand Forks, and some of them are in Penticton. So I picked this up serendipity. I didn't even know. I thought, okay, it looks like a pretty good cover, and 70 years ago, so history kind of repeats itself, comes around full circle.
You've got to spend more time reading your newspaper in the morning, you know.
I guess I do.
You're just going to discover these stuff. Okay, so Sam Bambini, one afternoon after being skunked by hunting, is just walking back. He's walking back through, and probably not in that highly discovered zone, but maybe a little further south, around Skeff Creek. Kind of a pit, what, 3 feet deep, 4 feet deep?
It was a little bigger
Filled
than
with
that. I think it was 8 or 10.
now?
No, not in that particular part of the boundary country. It's too high. And so it was about 8 or 10 feet across, as I recall. I don't recall all the details, but I remember listening to him carefully. If I had been sharper, I would have said, Sam, well, how close were you to Deadmans Hill? How close were you to Mount Atwood? How close were you to May Creek? How close were you to Skeff Creek? Well, I didn't ask those questions.
If only.
Yeah, but all the geological occurrences are absolutely perfect.
So maybe the lost Sam Bambini mine is still there, and all you have to do is go out and trudge through the bush. Thank you very much. Bill Barley, our storyteller. Join us again next time for Gold Trails and Ghost Towns.